systemic in that, in the sort of macro sense.
I'm not mad. I just want to know what it is you're talking
No,
about.
no, that's
We can
exactly what that's.
Yeah.
Believe me, that's 100% what I wanted to have you.
Blacks are not getting into school. BS. We have we have affirmative action. So a black person with an SAT and a GPA of X will get into a school faster and easier than a white person with an SAT or a GPA of X. And if going to school is a route to the middle class, you can make an argument that blacks have an easier route to the middle class. If you're talking about blacks about poverty. The poorer you are, the more accessible loans and grants are for you. The problem, the biggest burden that black people have, in my opinion, again, is the percentage of blacks, 75% of them, that are raised without fathers. And that has every other social negative consequence connected to it. Crime, not being able to compete economically in the country, being more likely to be arrested, that's the number one problem facing the black community. And when I hear people tell me about systemic racism or unconscious racism, I always say, give me an example, and almost nobody can do it.
So the family stuff, so I'll follow your logic there. On the family stuff, what can actually be done about that then? I mean, because that's a big...
Reverse the welfare state. In 1890, 1900, you look at census reports, a black kid, believe it or not, was slightly more likely to be born to a nuclear intact family than a white kid. Even during slavery, a black kid was more likely to be born under a roof with his biological mother and biological father than today. What's happened is we launched this so-called war on poverty in the 60s, where literally Lyndon Johnson sent people knocking on doors. And I lived in the 60s, and people knocked on doors apprising women of their availability to welfare, provided there was no man in the house. And we went from 25% of blacks being born outside of wedlock in 65 to 75% right now. And you look at how much money that we spent on welfare, and the lines are parallel. It was a neutron bomb dropped on this country, not just in the black community, but on people in general. At one time, only about 5% of whites were born outside of wedlock. Now 25% of whites are born outside of wedlock. I was in college in 1970, and there was a report called the Moynihan Report, The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. It was written by a liberal, by a man who became a Democratic senator from New York. And at the time, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. He said, my God, this number is horrific. If we don't do something about it, it could get even higher. Well, fast forward, 25% of white kids are now born outside of wedlock. It is the number one problem in this country, and what we've done, in my opinion, is we've economically incentivized women to marry the government, and we've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. And now we have this.
So do you
and the left has done this.
Right, okay, so do you think then that as a black conservative, that the biggest issue is it's impossible to have this conversation? Right, like the stuff we're talking about right now is rarely really discussed in the media. You know, you've written some books about it, and it's people talk about it every now and again, but we rarely have this discussion because, and this is where I will agree with you, that the left has made language such a problem, and everyone's so trigger-warned in safe space, that we're afraid that if you have this conversation, that somehow I'm going to come off racist.
That's not why we don't have the conversation. We don't have the conversation because the left would then have to look in the mirror and go, Jesus H. Christ, look at what I've done. And they don't want to do this. I've had a radio show for almost 25 years. I've invited Jesse Jackson on 50 times, 60 times. I've invited Al Sharpton on that number. Maxine Waters, another loudmouth black woman around here who's running around talking about racism. She won't come on my show either. They don't want to deal with these issues. Why? Let's have a conversation. If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me how I'm wrong. Give me your data. Give me your facts. Tell me what you got.
Yeah.
And I could quote the Brookings Institution, which is a liberal think tank, and the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, and they'll both tell you that there's a relationship between crime and bad schools, and going to prison and not having a dad. So this is not just a liberal kind of thing or a conservative kind of thing. It's a real world kind of thing, and they don't want to have that conversation. I've never heard a reporter ask Obama about the connection between the rise of the single-parent household and the rise of welfare spending. I've never heard anybody ask him that question, not one time.
Yeah.
And so, as far as I'm concerned, there's this desire not to have this conversation for fear that it then will cause you to rethink your assumptions. A psychologist would call that cognitive dissonance. This anxiety that you feel when you have had your assumptions challenged and you don't want to do it. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah. So how